Okay, guys. So here I have my second match against the War Admiral. I believe I sat first in this game also. So he sat second. Possibly more likely to be a fish. So I raise my button. I get flatted. I get a 10-9-6 with a flush draw flop, and I c bet. So I don't c bet this sort of flop always. It's certainly not a great one to c bet. But all we know about this guy so far is that he called a bet out of position 1 out of 1 time. So he could have a loose out of position range. It's more likely than not. And additionally, I do have a gut shot here, so I have some outs. Um, uh, and my 8 high doesn't really have any showdown value either. So I think it's a decent spot to c bet. I'm not fist pumping, but I think it's all right. So this turn, so after he calls, we get this Queen of Hearts turn. I think it improves a lot of his stuff, right? So he could have, we don't know anything about him. He could have check called with a flush draw. He could have check called with Queen Jack, King Queen, King Jack, or a variety of sorts. You pair stuff at the Queen. But he can also have a ton of things in his range that just pick up a little bit of extra equity, so they're going to call once, but then are pretty likely to fold the river, right? So stuff, any sort of any of the pairs that have a heart to go with them, not to mention a 7 or an 8 or a Jack or a King. I think a ton of those hands are going to call again on the turn, but then be pretty prone to folding river on a blank, which is on most cards. So I think this is a good spot to 3-barrel against a lot of people, just because they're going to end up having a lot of calling hands on the turn that fold rivers like this one, right? So I think I'll be able to identify good rivers to bluff pretty easily. It's not going to be very difficult for me to identify which of the rivers are good to bluff. However, I decided not to do that here, mostly because this is the first hand. I feel like people don't really give you quite as much credit the first hand, but also I have reason to believe this might be a weaker player, and some guys just don't like to fold, right? And I'd like to make some reads before I make some big high variance sort of plays. Another reason this is a good spot though to triple barrel against a lot of people is that you're going to hear from a lot of good hands on the turn. So obviously, if he check raises the turn, we can just fold. Whereas if so when he check calls and we get to a river, he's more likely just to have one of those sort of weak hands, that were combo draws on the turn but are just weak on the river. And additionally, with our 8 here, I think this is if we are going to barrel off on this board sometimes, having some random 8 is a decent choice to do it, because there's some value betting. There's some rivers that we can actually value bet to. Okay. So anyway, I decided not to here, and I think he ends up leading the river. Okay, yeah, he leads for full pot, and I guess I snap fold because I have 8 high. But let's think about his range a little bit. Actually, I guess it's pretty wide here, right? Like he check calls his flop a ton. He can have a variety of draws. A lot of them got there, some of them didn't. So it's hard to say whether or not he's doing this as sort of a value bet or a bluff. I think it's fair to say that, well, if he does get here with air, this is going to be a profitable bet with sort of an any 2 cards sort of thing. It's not clear if he does get here with much air, so we don't have to worry too much about being exploited. But if he were to get to this point with air, he could certainly bet it profitably, because I'm not calling this bet of 200 very often at all after I check back the turn. Okay, second hand, I have ace 5 offsuit. Our opponent folds. Okay, great. So he folded a a small blind. That tells us he might be tight. I mean, a lot of fish who are looser don't fold that many small blinds because they just limp or whatever, and a lot of regs just raise all their small blinds, or at least the vast majority of them. And the second hand here, he again folds pre-flop. Third hand, he also, it's the fourth hand total, but it's the third hand on the row that he's folded pre-flop. So he's folded 3 out of 4 hands pre-flop so far in both of his buttons. So with good likelihood, we can give him sort of a tight pre-flop range. Okay, so I make a standard open here with a 8-7 offsuit, and he actually leads into us. This is pretty interesting. There's definitely some draws possible, flush draws, straight draws. He could certainly have a 3 or a queen or an 8. If we think back to that first hand, which was quite a drawy board, right? It was like a uh, I'm already forgetting. Right, I think it was like a Jack 9-8 or something, or even a 10-9-8. So that was a board where people, were big blinds. If this guy was a reg, we don't know yet, but if he was a reg, a lot of regs are going to be leading that board, a lot, because it's not a board people will expect other regs to c-bet very much, and so on. There's a whole dynamic there. So he didn't lead in that past hand, where he ended up potting the river, and so he presumably, I think he does usually have a value hand in that previous spot. So he check called that flop with a hand that was probably a value hand on the river, whether that was a draw or whether it was a strong enough hand on the flop that he ended up potting the river. So the strong hands on the, let me just go back actually, stuff that was like not, so the stuff that was strong enough to pot for value on the river is like draws and maybe queens, maybe like king queen or queen jack, or stuff that made 2 pair by hitting that queen, or flop slow plays. So he didn't lead this flop presumably with either a draw or some flop slow play or whatever. I guess what I'm saying is it's sort of weird that he didn't lead this board and he is leading that other one, because a lot of the sort of hands that he would have been able to bet big on that past on the second or on the first hand's river, a lot of the hands that he would have been able to bet big with on the first hand's river are hands that he might have led the flop with if he was the sort of player to lead drawy flops. And so I guess what I'm saying is I'm a little confused about what he's doing this with, but we'll just play it out. So first of all, we're going to start off with a call, because we have a good enough hand to call. And then we get a deuce on the turn. It's a pretty good card for us. It doesn't improve any of the draws in particular, or really even any of the semi-bluffs, being an undercard. He bets again. Okay, he makes a pretty small bet. It could be a queen trying to value town us, but it also could be sort of a weaker hand, or just a hand that sort of wants to see another street. So I think we can still put like flush draws and such in his range, and possibly even some bluffs. I'm not giving him a lot of bluffs here in general, because folding preflop is strongly correlated with being tight in general. So so I expect him to be sort of a tight player here, but he can still certainly have flush draws or value hands. I think my call on the turn is a bit loose with that in mind, given that we don't really expect him to have many bluffs, or many pure bluffs, I should say. So I guess he can have flush draws, but his other value hands are sort of all beating us, and we have not many outs versus them. So I think my call on the turn was it's on the loose side. Certainly if a flop and turn lead on this board are getting me off of everything weaker than a queen, then he's just printing money by doing it as a bluff. But I don't necessarily have any reason to think he is doing it as a bluff, so I think I can make an exploitative fold. Luckily though, I rivered 2 pair, and so I don't expect to have too much of a decision if he bets again, except that he overbet jams. Okay, so what do we do here? So I think I only beat a bluff, first of all. I don't think he's going to be doing this with very many, just like bare queens, for example. I don't think I beat any of his value hands, basically. It's possible that some people do this sort of thing with 2 pair, but I don't think any of the weaker 2 pairs are really in his preflop range, right? The 8-3, 8 deuce, 7-3, 7 deuce, 3 deuce. Given what we've seen from him previously, we can expect him to fold all that stuff preflop. So if he does have 2 pair, it's maybe the same one, but probably a better 2 pair. And I don't think he does this with queen. We don't really have too strong reads, but I feel like it's just very rare that I see people do this sort of thing with 1 pair. even if we had that sort of dynamic where he might want to level me into calling, we have maybe sort of a reggy dynamic where people try to level other people to call with relatively weak hands with big bets, right? If that makes sense. Like, so you might expect a reg, in a reg versus reg match, you might expect our player two here to show up with a mediocre queen here sometimes. The fact is, I don't really expect that here because even if this guy is a reg, which I don't think is the I don't really know, but I don't have any reason to think is the case. I also think he doesn't have any reason to think I'm a reg, and I'm gonna be leveling myself into a call because I'm new to the site. So I think he basically here has no value hands that are worse than mine. So I have just a pure bluff catcher. So the other question is, does he have? So if I have a pure bluff catcher, I just have to weigh off the size of his bluff range versus the size of his value range. His value range is kind of weird, right? Like, given his bet sizing, his turn bet sizing didn't really imply that he wanted to jam river a lot, right? Or that he wanted to go big for value. He went pretty small on the turn, which makes me think that maybe he wasn't planning on jamming river, or at least he wasn't trying to set up for a river bet that that wanted a lot of calls. So could this 7 have improved him to an overbet jammable value hand? Oh, it's possible. He could have queen 7 exactly. I don't think 7-7 is very likely. 8-7 I suppose is possible. But I think queen 7 is sort of the only hand that really makes sense as far as the 7 improving him. And that's just one hand. On the other hand, there are a lot of missed draws. There's some straight draws and then the obvious flush draw. But you have to weigh that off against the fact that the fact that there aren't that many value hands, but there are a number of hands that he could potentially be bluffing with, kind of makes it seem like a call. But on the other hand, people don't bluff this way that much, I don't think. I don't think it's bad necessarily. I think I'm folding enough here that he can do it profitably. I'm thinking about folding 2 pair, which is like the very top of my range. And I think I would certainly fold, mediocre queens. So I do think it's a profitable bluff. If he has, a missed flush draw here or something. But people just don't do it that much. People don't, it's very standard to bluff here, 350 chips or something. But the overbet shove is kind of rare. So even if he gets here with a lot of more air hands and value hands, people don't tend to bluff that way. Whereas some guys do just overbet shove for value when they happen to show up here with a set or something. So I think it's close. It's sort of an unfortunate spot. But I have 2 pair, and I'm not really big on folding, so I do end up making the call here. But against a fish who we've already identified as probably kind of tight, I think it might be a fold. And the only thing that I think is weird is his turn bet sizing, which really didn't sell me at all on a strong hand, or on a particularly strong hand anyway. So I do call, and he does show down the missed nut flush draw. So very interesting. Definitely think we should make a note of his play with the nut flush draw, how he played on the early streets, and also his ability to overbet shove there. Also, I feel like we can draw some conclusions about maybe some more big picture conclusions, right? The fact is that I don't really think this was just like some spewy move, right? The fact is the guy's folded most of his hands pre-flop, so presumably he's a fairly tight player, and yet he played this a draw pretty aggressively and overbet shoving the river, which is something of an advanced move. So actually, I think at this point we can identify this player as quite possibly some sort of reg, maybe someone who's even aware of sort of the hand ranges, and so how he can size his bets when I have sort of a bluff catcher type range and he's fairly polar. So some fairly advanced. So I think we might be able to see this hand as indicative of him understanding some fairly advanced concepts. if he had been, spewy in the previous four hands, then maybe I would just say, oh, he's, a spewy fish. But given that he's been pretty tight in the previous hands, we have to sort of reconcile that behavior with this, bet, bet, over bet, shove. And I think the most likely way to reconcile those facts is just to think that, maybe he's actually, a fairly advanced player. So here we're down to 6 big blinds or whatnot. Coffee Hut has built-in Nash charts, very convenient. And where we are now. So I guess the blinds just went up also. But at 4 or 5 big blinds or whatever, I'm just playing Nash essentially generally. Let me speed up the video a bit. As usual, I think it's super important to take notes on opponents in order to help yourself make better reads on in later hands, and also just to solidify your your understanding of your opponent's strategies in the current games. So again, a small sample of his pre-flop play so far, but we can take a look at his small stack stats and what we have so far. So we just have two hands for call, open, shove. He's called one, folded one, and then from the small blind, his VPIP has been quite small. So I think at this point, oh well, he called with he called 10 big blinds there with 8-7. So I was gonna say that just like his pre-flop stats in deeper stacks, we sort of identified him as kind of a tight player. That carried over shorter stacks too, as far as we could tell. But that 8-7 call was a little loose and maybe indicative of not that. So I limp here with a King 10, which is interesting. I don't necessarily think it's good. In fact, yeah, I don't really think it's good. I don't really think we have any reason to expect him to be let me pause it. I don't really think we have much reason to expect him to be raising our limps particularly wide. I think it's an okay hand to mix into your limping range in general. It's certainly one that you can call a shove with against someone who you think is raising your limps wide. It plays just fine post flop too. So because of those two things, it's a fine hand to limp. But this guy, I think, is just he's folding a lot pre-flop, and we just make a lot of money stealing his blind every time. So I think raising and just trying to steal his blind a lot is going to be the best approach to short stack play against this player. So I stab flop. I think that he's going to fold enough to make it perfectly profitable to c-bet with any two cards, and given that we have a reasonably strong hand, it's even better. There's a little reason to check back here against some guys who are somewhat more aggressive, because it's kind of a pain to get. It's kind of unfortunate to get check shoved on, and we can get check shoved on here kind of a lot by not only spade hands, but also pairs that kind of want to protect. So we can't really call a shove, but we do give up a lot of equity, and we don't necessarily ever fold out better hands by c-betting. And in fact, if we do fold out some other hands, we miss out on some implied odds, possibly two on later streets, if that makes sense, right? So there's certainly some cards that can come that can give him a second best hand to us that he would fold to a c-bet, right? In particular, or most obviously, if he has a lower spade and we check back and the 8 of spades comes, we can get a value bet in, whereas he would have folded the flop. So I think actually, now that I think about it some more, I don't really like limping pre-flop, nor do I really like betting the flop. So poorly played so far. um, but anyway, let's move on. So we turn this, we turn a 10 high flush. I go ahead and value bet it. I do like the value bet here. I think our 10 high flush is good most of the time. I mean, remember that we limped like 12 big blinds deep. So presumably, if he had any sort of ace or or to some degree king, certainly any ace we would expect just to jam over us. And a lot of king x are going to jam over us too. And then the queen of spades is on board, so that sort of just leaves the jack of spades that beats us. And sometimes the king, maybe sometimes an ace. We don't really know how this guy plays, but I think we can strongly discount a lot of high cards in general from his range based on the pre-flop play. He makes a small raise, which is kind of weird. We don't expect him to have that many bluffs in range, right? Like after he check calls the flop,